Hello, and welcome to Hopeful Conversations brought to you by Robbie's Hope Foundation. I am your host, Kari Eckert. Joining me today is Michelle Maikoetter from the Neurosequential Network. The Neurosequential Network utilizes the neurosequential model created by Dr. Perry as a way to map out the development of a brain accounting for all unique adversities, experiences, and relationships. Michelle has trained directly with Dr. Perry and was actually one of the first Child Trauma Academy Fellows selected in 2012. Michelle has since then put her neurosequential expertise to use through educational and residential settings. Recently, she served for 17 years as a program officer at Farley's Boys Ranch in Texas. Her dedication to our youth and the determination to help others overcome their trauma has led her to become one of the most sought-out trauma-informed professionals in the childcare specialists in the United States. Michelle, thanks so much for joining me today on Hopeful Conversations.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here and be able to talk to you.
Let's start with, can you help me understand what the neurosequential model is?
Yes. So I learned about the neurosequential model back in 2009, I think. I read it. I was reading a journal, and one of the articles in the journal, I didn't understand the title, and so I skipped over it. And then when I finished all the other articles in the journal, I felt like I needed to go back and look at that one. And it was called The Neurosequential Model of Therapeutics. And it was written by Dr. Perry. And once I read that article, I was just intrigued and amazed about the possibilities. And so I started trying to learn more. And at that time, Bruce was really just starting to formalize his thoughts and his processes for sharing his knowledge. And so at the very basic, it's just a lens to look at behaviors and understand how early adversity, just like what you said, early adversity and our relational health help form our neural networks and lay down the foundation for everything after that. So that 0 to 3 that we used to think wasn't that important because we're not going to remember or have cognitive ability to talk about it, we realize now is the exact opposite, that most of that neural wiring gets laid down early on, up to about 85% of it before you're 3. And so anything that happens during that time has a disproportionate impact on later functioning, your ability to regulate, your ability to have relationships, just your ability to do almost everything in your life. And so I was intrigued. And so we started training with him in 2010 and then became certified in his model in 2012. And so I worked on implementing that model in a residential setting with at-risk youth. And then about 3 years ago, Dr. Perry asked me to come work for him directly. And so I do contract work with him, teaching other people about the neurosequential model.
85% by the age of 3. Now, yeah. We don't we don't work in that. I want to find the right words here, but I don't think we as humans look at our development in that lens.
We don't. I think we really look at young people as being young adults, right? Like they're just smaller versions of ourselves, and they should be able to do the things that we do as adults, think like us, act like us, control their impulses like us, without really appreciating that the reason why the model is called neurosequential is because our brain does develop in a sequential manner, and it develops from the most primitive processes. If you just think about breathing and metabolism and temperature and all those kind of things, the very basic things forms first in utero, and then we don't fully develop that frontal cortex. We do a lot of talking about executive functioning and that kind of thing, but that doesn't fully form until you're about your mid-20s, late 20s. And so we tend to think of children as just being little adults that should have all these capacities and capabilities that they just developmentally, biologically are not able to function in that manner until they get older and have more experiences. Yeah.
More recent research, correct me if I'm wrong, is showing that the development of the brain fully is delaying further, and maybe that there's a correlation of that delay due to the environment that we're growing in a lot with social media and our phones. Am I It's right
I
by
think,
stating that.
yeah, I don't think that's a stretch to think about. We are meant to grow in relationship with other people, and we're social beings. And so we are meant to be in those kind of relationships. And so I can see how if we're more isolated and more of our interactions are through devices and other things, and we're not getting that kind of face to face, that would be the case. We also know that anyone that grows up with a lot of adversity or abuse, neglect, trauma early on typically is developmentally behind their chronological age, again, because we are meant to grow in those kind of healthy relationships to get us to where we are. And so a lot of the kids that I work with are typically developmentally behind their chronological age and their more typical peers because of the adversity that they've been through.
Yeah. Can you help us understand just like the hierarchy of the brain functions, like which part of our brain does what for our thinking and our body?
Yeah, and I'll just give a disclaimer. This is a model, right? And so all models are useful and they help us understand complex things, but it's definitely not 100% accurate because we're trying to take something so sophisticated and bring it down to our understanding. And so Bruce's model, Dr. Perry's model, he talks about the brain as having 4 areas, and so he breaks it down to the brainstem, the diencephalon, the limbic, and then the frontal cortex. And so it would that was again that most primitive to the most sophisticated. And so the brainstem being responsible for those really primitive things we talked about, and the diencephalon really being the one that kind of sifts through processing the sensory information that comes in. The limbic system more about that social, emotional, relational aspect, and then that frontal cortex being, realizing time, thinking abstractly, looking to the future, planning ahead, and those kind of things. And when we talk about the brain, we typically only think about that frontal cortex and think everyone's living in that frontal cortex at all times, which is just not the case. And for any one of us, how we can function, how we can relate to one another, how much awareness we have, how much control we have of our actions and our behaviors has to do with that state that we're in the present moment. And so we shift in all of those abilities at every given time based on which area of the brain is more in control, because the brain's really more like an orchestra where certain sections are supposed to be stronger at certain times and recede at certain times. And it's meant to work together and to come out when it needs to come out and recede when it needs to come, when it needs to go away. So when you need to be, if you're being chased by a tiger, that lower brain takes over and you have a very instinctual reaction and you run or you do whatever you need to do. But if you're in a board meeting and you need to be thoughtful and calm, hopefully that frontal cortex is in control and you're able to be thoughtful and intentional and creative about what you want to do. Now, unfortunately, we're all much more complex than that, and we move back and forth all the time, depending on the situation, depending on our physical state, our emotional state, our social state, all those kind of things. And then if you think about any kind of experiences you've had, relational experiences, any kind of trauma that you've experienced could come up at any time. So, mostly beyond our awareness and could put us into a mode where we feel like we have to be defensive or we have to be protective of ourselves. And then we might be, acting more primitively than we would like to act in those given moments.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
It's so interesting though. And I just think where does a young person that, I'm thinking of my son, 15 years old, possibly where his brain was at in the days prior to his death by suicide, where functioning of a depressed brain or an anxious brain of a 15-year-old could possibly be.
Yeah. And and I think what we look at is that emotional part of the brain that not that it's separate from every other piece of the brain, but really in adolescence, that limbic system, that emotional system, that system that has to do with being a part and fitting in, right? That's really the most at play in those teenage years, which is why we see, some high risk behaviors and then some to need to be a part of the group to feel like you're going to be okay. And so when we see some of those things compromised, I think it's really hard because that frontal cortex isn't fully developed yet for that frontal cortex to override it and say it's going to be okay. It's not always going to be like this. In the future, things may not feel this bad, because in that time, when you're in that limbic, that emotional part of the brain, it feels like this is all it's ever going to be, and it's never going to get any better. And so then, which is why that's so difficult. These kinds of things are so difficult because our brains are trying to protect us and keep us alive, but sometimes they really get the information wrong and they really try to overwork and overfunction to the point of telling us this is really bad and it's never going to get any better.
We like the word hope. Robbie's hope. Hold on, pain ends. And
yes.
For a 15-year-old, a 13-year-old, an 8-year-old, can be a really hard concept to embrace. I think
yes.
As a 51-year-old, I wonder where my brain sometimes developmentally could be, because sometimes it's easy for that part of my brain to take over and say,
yes.
It's going to be like this forever. It's not going to get better.
Absolutely. And so I do think just like what you're doing, but I think it's so important to educate each other about how our brains function and how amazing our brains are, and that they are trying to help us, right? Even though sometimes they do us a disservice, but most of the time they're trying to keep us alive. I think we confuse that with trying to keep us happy. The brain's not that concerned about being happy. It's concerned about being alive. And so its concern is constantly survival. And so sometimes when you get into those really, heavy places, those dark places, the brain is so focused on survival, it can't see anything outside of that. And so then we tend to get very lonely and feel like we're the only ones, and not able to see people are out there to help us and can help us, because we're just kind of in it too deep to be able to see that. And so I do think the more you learn about your brain and what your brain tries to do to keep you safe, and how all of our brains are very similar in that way, is very helpful to people to have, I think, just some grace for each other and for ourselves about, when things don't go the way, because it's real easy for us to look back when the frontal cortex comes back online, to look back and go, I could have done this, I should have done this, why didn't I do that? Because we're not in that moment where we're in our emotional brain, or that survival part of our brain that's really overtaking us. And so I think it really helps to understand all this functioning, so that we can again have a little bit more grace and understanding for when we make mistakes, when other people make mistakes, instead of always assuming it was purposeful or intentional or thought out, or all these kind of things we when we don't have the story or the context for, we make up that they knew exactly what they were doing and they did that on purpose, and all these kind of things, without really understanding that most of the time we have some very pre-conscious reactions to things that we don't even really understand ourselves. Because the brain is so sophisticated in the way that it makes memory and the way that it learns.
Wow. Keeping us alive versus keeping us happy. Our brain's job.
Yes.
But as humans in the social media world of 2024, we want to be happy all of the time.
Yes.
Oh, goodness. Yeah. How does the average person learn more about their brain and maybe to work with their brain?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, there's a lot of good books up there. Of course, I'm going to say Bruce's latest book with Oprah, What Happened to You, I think is so accessible. He's written some other books. They're a little bit heady, a little bit more scientific. I think What Happened to You, that conversation with Oprah, she just does a beautiful job of illustrating his points, I think, personally with her own life. And so I do think that's a good way to start. There's a free book study online that I think would be beautiful for everyone who has the chance to share that book with other people and to work through some of those discussions. I just think there's so much about our shared humanity that we just don't understand, and that when that is opened up to you, you see the entire world differently, not just the clients or the people that you think you're trying to help, but the whole world. You just see it differently, and a little bit more, a little bit nicer light, or a little bit more forgiving light.
Shared humanity. I love your choice of words. Beautiful. Okay. I want to hop back a little bit to the neurosequential model and just talk about like developmental age and how we can bring that into how we maybe help someone that is struggling, and so that we treat them appropriately.
Yeah. So I just think just understanding that is that sometimes based on if you've had adverse experiences and maybe not some consistent healthy relationships in your life, because relationships are meant to be our buffers and our mediators for adversity. And sometimes if you have had more adversity than you've had relational health, that adversity has more of an impact on you. And so just knowing that, any given day, some of us are functioning I used to believe you could function 100% every day. Now I know that's not, that's just impossible. That some days you're 65%, some days you might be 85%, but it fluctuates depending on all these factors that contribute to that. And so really understanding that a lot of especially kids and families that come into the systems that I work in, which are, systems for at-risk families and youth, have had trauma, have had generational trauma often, not just a single incident trauma, but generations of really difficult living, whether that be poverty, housing insecurity, domestic violence, addictions, all those kind of things, is that when you are stuck in survival for a consistent amount of time, that makes it really hard for you to be thoughtful about next year or 5 years from now or those kind of things, because you really are stuck in survival mode. And so Bruce had written a beautiful paper called When States Become Traits. And it's like it can be to the point where you are in that state so much, it becomes who you are. Your systems become rewired to be in survival mode all the time. We call it sensitized, but your stress response system is overly sensitized. And so you're overreactive and over responsive because your brain feels like it has to do that to keep you safe. And so realizing that we are all different in what we've experienced. We're all different in what kind of relationships we've experienced. And I can't assume that your experience is the same as mine and that you should understand things the way I understand them and respond to them the way that I respond to them, because your brain is filtering everything that you hear, smell, taste, feel through your experiences and your relationships. And any of those things that match up. So it could be my voice today. It could be the way I look today. It could be that I remind you of someone in the past. Anything about me could say to your brain, this is a positive, cue, or this is a negative cue to be afraid of. And so you might immediately have a feeling about me one way or the other. It would have nothing to do with me. But it was based on something you've experienced in the past that your brain is filtering it through, because your brain filters all incoming information through that lowest part of the brain, and it filters it against all those past experiences and relationships. And so I think just understanding that something that happens that isn't stressful for me doesn't mean it shouldn't have been stressful for that person, because I don't know what's happening for that person in that moment.
Oh, wow. Can we rewire that basic functioning for people that have been in that sustained state?
So I think for all of us, and again, I'm about hope too. I mean, I definitely don't make to say this, once it's done, or I wouldn't be in this field at all. But we have to know, we have to understand development, and we have to be intentional about it. And so if you just think about some of the things very early on, so when a baby's born, how we provide what we call regulation. How do you soothe them? How do you calm them? And it's these rhythmic, repetitive pattern sort of things: singing, rocking, swaddling, having these kind of rhythmic interactions where the baby cries and the caregiver responds is what you're hoping, right? There's this
spots.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so that low brain really responds to rhythmic, repetitive, patterned activities. So if you think about just everyday kind of things, so if you've ever been really upset, what did you have to do to calm yourself down? Because most of the time, like when I'm really upset, you coming to talk to me or you trying to hug me is not going to help me, right? It's just going to irritate me. And so I have to go for a walk. I have to take some deep breaths. I have to go listen to music. Music is one of the things that really helps our brains regulate. And so thinking about some of those lower brain kind of physical things, we call them somatic, but where your body is part of it, instead of thinking that we always have to talk someone down. And so there's top down, where you can calm yourself by talking yourself. It's okay. This isn't that big a deal when you have that frontal cortex online. But you can also do bottom up, where you calm yourself down by doing something physical, something rhythmic, repetitive, and patterned that helps settle that lower brain down, so the frontal cortex can come back online. Does it help when I make all these hand signals?
It does. Yes. Oh, yeah. Wow. Does it change? Can it change for the same person, like in different experiences? Like sometimes it's going to have to come from the lower part versus the top part, like
right,
based on just that experience, just the wiring of that person?
Yeah, so based on the intensity of that experience, right? And so there may be times when you're a little upset and you can just talk yourself through it, or a friend can say, hey, that wasn't as big a deal as what you're making it, and you go, okay. But if you think about times you've been really, really, and we call it dysregulated, so when you're not calm, when you're not, in your best self, But when you're really dysregulated, and you can kind of think about some irrational things you've done or said, right? Because that lower area of the brain was in control. And so you were more reactive and more emotional. And so then what did it take for you to get back to a point where you were calm and regulated enough to be intentional and thoughtful in what you do? And so the more upset, the more intense, the more tired, the more you don't feel well, all those kind of things affect your ability to access that part of your brain that helps you be in control and thoughtful. And so it does change for all of us on any given day. And it's also why we'll talk about one small thing that happens that we're like, I can't believe that's what pushed me over the edge. But we know it was the 99 other things that got us to that point where this thing was the absolute last thing I could handle. And so, any given day, if we haven't slept well, if we had a fight with someone, if we're worried about someone in the hospital, and then one more thing happens or two more things happen, our functioning just gets more primitive and more reactive because we're not able to stay in that regulated place where we have full access to our cognitive abilities.
I'm taking a minute to just like digest this because it's like I feel like I can look at like my day yesterday and like very much attribute like how I reacted to certain things just by looking through that lens. And
yes.
Also like as a fairly high functioning adult, even though I have significant carry trauma in my life, like how frustrating that is that I expect to be able to
always
just be in that front part of, and it doesn't always work that way.
No, and we're not meant to function that way. We wouldn't be alive, right? If we functioned up here all the time, that lower area of our brain processes information so much faster. So if you think about a time you've ever jumped out of the way of something or caught something that was unexpected, and you think, man, that was a ninja move, right? And it was that lower brain. It was having a instinctual reaction in that moment before it even got to your cortex, because it takes it a while to process that information all the way up to the cortex. So sometimes you'll jump out of the way or do something, and it's before you even realize you saw it or you heard it, right? Because that lower brain has taken over, moved you out of the way. And so we don't want to live in that cortex, but we have very much conditioned ourselves to believe that's who we are, and that's where we should be all the time.
Safe versus happy.
Yes.
Safe versus happy. Oh, wow. And certainly like different experiences, different adversities affect different people in different ways.
Yes, absolutely. Like I always think about the example of if I'm standing in line somewhere, if I'm at the movies and I'm standing in line, do people go to the movies anymore? I don't know. But if I was at the movie standing in line and somebody taps me on the shoulder, because I've had traumas, but I've had a pretty positive developmental experience growing up. My first thought is somebody must know me. Someone's tapping me on the shoulder because they want to say hello to me. But you can imagine if you've had adversity in your past, maybe if you were abused or the things were unpredictable in your life, that somebody taps you on the shoulder, you might have a startled response. You might have a defensive response. You might turn around and be ready to hit somebody. And so for us to really understand, and again, that would have nothing to do with the person tapping them on the shoulder, right? And I think that's what gets so hard for us, is that some of these things come out and sometimes we're the recipient of them, but it doesn't mean it had anything to do with us. And most of the time it doesn't. And especially when you're a teacher, when you're a foster parent, when you're an adopted, when you're a parent sometimes too, right? I mean, there's just all these things that come up that are from our past experiences that our brain is saying, this is something to be worried about. This is a threat to us because in the past it was a threat to us. And that lower brain doesn't know time. That lower brain is only in the moment and only about survival. And so when it experiences something that it feels is threatening, it's only in that moment. And it takes it a while to get to that cortex for the cortex to say, it's not that big a deal. Somebody's just tapping you on the shoulder, right? And so, we all shift at any given time with any given experience. I always talk about I'm a really bad traveler. Like when I travel, I get really stressed out and I can't make good decisions. And I really need a handler with me to say, no, Michelle, you're not going to get in that stranger's car just because they offer to share a rental car with you. Because I just get so tired and I get overwhelmed and then I don't make good decisions. And so it's things like that to be aware of. I know I am not at my best when I travel, and that I need to put in some things that help me. If I'm going to speak somewhere, I'm going to do something, I need to have some things in place to make sure that I'm not, totally stressed out and overwhelmed by the time I get there.
I could hear that coming, like even from like the tapping on the shoulder, like learning that, okay, like maybe if somebody taps me on the shoulder and it's put me into this fight response, like
Mm-hmm.
immediately, like, okay, take a breath
Mm-hmm.
before I turn around to see what's going on, or
Mm-hmm.
travel. I know this is going to be a stressful day. I'm not going
Yep.
to maybe make those best choices. What can I put in place? So
Yes.
is that what you're trying to do with the neurosequential model?
Yes. And to think about how, if you are already, so let's just say your baseline, and I always talk about COVID, right? So like before COVID, I would have told you my baseline state of arousal was somewhere between calm and alert, right? And that's where you want to be. That's where you learn best. That's where you have a lot of flexibility. But after COVID, when we were in this sustained, unpredictable, severe, uncontrollable amount of stress that we all went through, I think all of our baselines dropped, a little bit more. And so I was no longer in this kind of calm and reflective space. I was more a reactive space than what I would typically, more emotional space, let's say, typically. And so you can imagine if you were already in that emotional space to begin with, and then you went through COVID, then you dropped into that survival space where you were more reactive and that kind of thing. And so you can see, and you can apply that to an individual, you can apply that to a family system, you can apply that to a government system. These systems that get more and more overwhelmed and overtaxed, and then how they drop in their ability to function and to be creative and flexible and adaptable and really problem solve. All those things drop. And so we do that too, right? So we drop in our abilities to be able to be kind of to reconcile with people, to be creative, to really understand the other person's side. Because to be empathic, you have to be in that cortex to imagine what you must feel like about this. That's where I have to be. And if I'm not in there, I'm going to be more about me and more about my protection and my survival. And so you can see how, based on your past experiences and relationships, how you bring that expectation, although it's deeper than an expectation, right? It's an experience, how you bring that experience of how people are and how I am and how people are going to treat me based on all of that past experience and relationships.
I'm listening.
I could see, I
And I'm
could see.
processing, my brain, I want to ask, like, developmentally, like that shift to be able to not just be about me, but to also be about Michelle, like for I hate the word average, but like for
Typical.
average developmentally, like, and I hate the word appropriate, like,
Yeah.
is there a norm that happens for most, where you can make that shift, where it's not just my thoughts about my survival, my safety, but also about others?
Yeah. So I do think, I think it's a couple of different, it's developmental. I do think there's some things that have to happen, like in the work that I'm in, a lot of times, the kids receive a lot of physical things if they're in a placement or they're somewhere, there's a lot of donations, right? And so they get a lot of physical things. And so a lot of times people will say they're not grateful because they are getting a lot of physical things, but where they have not gotten a lot is through relationships, right? Which is where we're meant to get most of our emotional currency or our reward, our feeling of feeling good about ourselves. And so they have had a lot of physical things given to them, but in the absence of a lot of relational things that they needed in the first place. And so I do think there's a point where that those things have to be developmental, and that some needs have to be met before I get to the point that I can think about you or worry about the world or other people instead of just being concerned about me. And then I also think any one of us, even though you might have hit that developmental level, which I would have told you before COVID, that I was at that place where I could be empathic and I could think about the needs of other people. But during COVID, I was so stressed, I could only do what I could do for me. I couldn't even do my recycling. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but recycling felt so out of control to me. It was just one more thing that I didn't have the bandwidth to say, I'm going to do my recycling. And so you can see how developmentally you might have gotten to a place in your life where you had some good enough stuff that you got to that place that you could care about other people and worry about other things and try to help do more. But you can also be, you might be grieving, you might be having a traumatic event that you're not able to access that because you're in survival mode yourself. So again, you can see kind of the difference between those of us that are, and I say lucky enough to experience a single incident trauma which is difficult enough. Even if you didn't have developmental trauma, which is what we call trauma that you have experienced from early on, typically through your caregivers, where your needs weren't met the way they needed to be met, you've already created some vulnerability there, that when these single incident traumas come, it can really overwhelm you and overstress you, because you're already at that area of functioning where you're in survival more often than a lot of other people. Which is also why we can't say everyone should be able to handle something the way that I handled something, or should be able to get over something the way I go, because we just don't understand how differently wired we are and how lucky we are when we've had some, consistent, present, attentive, attuned, responsive caregivers that have helped create a system that is more resilient than those who have struggled with people who weren't able to provide that and create a vulnerability in their system.
Primary caregivers affect brain development significantly.
Yes.
What about our relationships now, like post-COVID, in this world of social media? Like, where are our relationships, like, collectively on average for a lot of like young people today that maybe that did have, protective and great primary caregivers? Like,
yeah, I think it's so much about balance with everything, right? Like, there's so many positive things about social media, and it's also a way to be connecting. And then there's other ways that we all use it. Adults too. The adults talk about kids, but the adults are doing the exact same thing, where we use it as an escape and an avoidance technique. And so I think it is a balance between it. It's good that there's some people that are reaching out for mental health help virtually that would have never done it, I don't think, if they didn't have that opportunity. So in one way, that's great, right? But there's also a way to completely avoid actual human relationship through using devices. And so and it's the same way with how we're trying to balance kids growing up, babies and infants and toddlers growing up in this age where devices are so much a part of our life and how we live and how we work. How do you balance using it, in a way that's healthy, and not use it to where that's all that they get, so that they're not receiving conversation, they're not having, oh, look, that's an apple. Oh, yeah, all these kind of things that it can be helpful. It can be helpful to an overwhelmed mom to be able to give a kid a tablet so they can get dinner made. But then where's the balance between how much time they're on that tablet and how much time are they in front of an actual human being who's attuned to them, who's paying attention to them, and not on their own devices? And I think it's going to be something that we're going to have to really, wrestle with. I think we're going to start going to these, retreats where it's like everybody puts their devices away and we're actually going to look at one another, because we're going to have to start paying people to tell us to structure our lives in a way that we're more intentional about those sort of things. And I think understanding your brain and what we're meant to do is helpful in that regard, because I don't think we've understood that very well, about why we need each other, and why we need to be. And I think all of this will be very interesting about the individuals that grow up so much on devices. I think it will shift, like how much reward they get from devices might be more than what my reward is, because I didn't grow up with that being a way to communicate with people. And so I think it will be an interesting thing. But
it's just like experiment that
it is
your children, that we just don't know what's going to happen yet.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Even physical touch. I've read some really interesting research about that, like in physical touch for adults as well, human contact.
Yes, and how much more, we're just living alone. So many more people live alone. So many more people live away from families and that kind of thing, that we've just created. Even it's one of those things that we have the ability to be almost totally independent and autonomous. But is that what we need? Is that what's best for us? That kind of thing. And so even that, just how we have chosen to live separate a lot, I think we'll have to relearn some of those things.
Wow. Yeah. This is such an interesting topic, and I do have more questions, but I want to be cognizant of our listeners' time and your time as well, Michelle. So the neurosequential motto, like, how can we apply that to the average person, just to education and potentially to the world of therapy? Because gratefully, a lot more of young people who need help are accessing therapy. What's the takeaway there?
Yeah. So Dr. Perry has put a lot of his information online. So he has a lot of free videos. A lot of it has to do with education. A lot of it has to do with caregivers. He put out a lot of really good information during COVID, just about why it was so difficult for all of us to be separated from one another, and how we are all meant to be in community where we buffer each other's stress and we help carry each other's stress. And when we were all separated like that, why that made it so difficult. And so there's a lot of free online resources. Again, that book, and then that book study guide is free as well. That's online.
What's that
I think that, so it's the neurosequential.com.
Okay.
Yep. And so there's a lot of good free materials out there, and there's some that are geared. There's one that's a PBS series that he's done geared towards educators and that kind of thing. But and then he also has programs where you can get certified in his model as an educator, as a therapist, as a coach. He has one that's for the neurosequential model in sports, which is beautiful because coaches have such a huge impact on kids. Not that teachers don't, they absolutely do, but just a whole other avenue. And then he has one for early childhood, so people working in really younger fields with that 0 to 3 specifically. And then we have reflective supervision, which is about working with people and growing yourself in the model and that kind of thing. And so there's a lot on his website that's really helpful and accessible to people.
Packed. Cool.
Yeah.
We just released a new handbook. We write handbooks about how to help one another, and particularly how to help teens. And we wrote a new one, and it's for athletes, and just a lot about that relationship that coaches have with their athletes versus maybe that parent, that teacher, and just how important that is in a lot of young people's lives.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. What's your best tip for self-regulation?
I mean, deep breaths. I know that sounds dumb, but it's always accessible to you, right? It's always accessible to you. And I think proactive deep breathing. I think we all wait until we're overwhelmed before we think I need to do something. And so I think any of the things that we can do, just like running, walking, listening to music, quiet time, meditation, whatever is your thing, that those are things that it's part of your health routine, right? Like it's meant to be in place all the time, not just when you're super stressed out, not just when you're angry, but so that when you get to that point, you have done some things to prepare you to be at a little bit better way to handle it, to be a little bit more regulated. And so I think, and then I think too, when I realize I'm going through a stressful period, I'm more intentional now about reaching out to my friends. Because I'm a big introvert. And so I usually wait until they call me, but I have gotten very intentional about I'm going through a stressful time. I'm going to call my friend. I'm going to text my friend. I'm going to arrange time. And that was one of the things COVID taught me too, is that I looked at this past year and I had visited more friends in this past year than I had in a long time, because we made it a point of it after COVID that this is important to us. We're going to take time to do it. We're going to make sure that we don't let anything override this or say that that's more important to us. And so I do think being intentional about those kind of things, when you know you're going through something or you're going to go through something, or being intentional about what kind of relational touch points do I need to put in place for myself to help with this, instead of getting into it and then I can't reach out and I can't see it because I'm already too overwhelmed and too stressed.
Really good advice. Intentional. Like I try to be intentional, but then I know that I have to stay flexible with those intentions.
Yes.
Like be able to make that shift.
Yes.
Well, this is such good, interesting information. I really so appreciate your time. But before I let you go, there's one last question that we ask our guests. And that question is, what does the world need to hear right now?
Everybody's doing their best.
Perfect. Everyone is doing their best.
Doing their best, even if it doesn't look that way to you. I always want to wear a t-shirt that say, I know it doesn't look like it, but I'm doing my best.
I like that.
Yep.
Oh, Michelle, I just really appreciate your time today and your wisdom and sharing with us. Thank you so much for joining us on Hopeful Conversations. To our listeners, remember, hold on, pain ends, and tune into our next episode. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.